So 4 years ago, I gave a very similar lecture to this very audience. It was live. It was just before 2020. And if you can remember way back before the pandemic occurred, where were you? And I can clearly say that this is where I was downtown without knowing what the future would hold. And it was live. I mean, things have changed so drastically since then. And I gave a lecture then. This was back in October 2019 for Prescription for a Long Life. And I was concerned about using the word long life because who can predict that one will have longevity? So I couched it in saying that it wasn't necessarily long life, but let's see if we can aim for best or quality or even happiness, the best quality or happy life. And I explained then what culinary medicine was, which I reiterate with each lecture, that it's evidence-based and it's blending food and cooking with the science of medicine and just really helping patients with personalized decisions on how to access high quality meals to try to really prevent using medications and the sequela of unhealthy foods. And about a year ago, I gave another lecture. This was not only what is culinary medicine, but taking the next step of how to create your culinary medicine prescription. As physicians, what we do, if you haven't noticed on your prescriptions, that RX really is medical prescription for use. It's based in us being original farmers and herbalists and using food as medicine. That RX was the shorthand for risipere, which is to take and receive, and it really was the original prescription in the medical sense. And what we do here is really talking about the quantity. How do we write a medication? It's the name of the medication, the milligrams, how much and how often. And that's not unlike recipes in making meals. We talk about the ingredients, we talk about the size, and what the time and frequency is. So with a whole new outlook and forward thinking, I'm going to tackle a prescription for a long life and really adhere to what long life is with plant-powered wellness. We're going to talk about the why. Here, actually, I have a basket that I gave my patient who I hadn't seen during COVID. And finally, when I met her in person, I gave her a box of things that you might find in your local Asian grocery, just to give her some familiarity of things that she might not have known before. And so we're going to be talking about the why. And I'll be scattering a demonstration of very simple pictures. So let's just start breaking down the hard questions of what is long life and what is life. So let's start with life first, and then let's talk about the longevity part of it. So what is basic life functions? We can take the quantitative aspect or the qualitative, but on the medical sense is respiration, circulation, cell production, and that's in its very essential form. And why do we eat? It's to live. So do we live to eat or eat to live? That's a debate that you can have over dinner. Essentially, that life is energy. You need a minimum requirement of calories, which is a measure of heat energy, to carry out these essential functions. It's not only just quantity, but also the quality of the energy that you put into your bodies. So we're moving away from the weight loss model of not just thinking about calories in and calories out as a way to gain weight or lose weight, but also focusing on the quality of the food that you are consuming. And if we think about where energy is derived from, primary producers, autotrophs, which are your plant, derive energy directly from the sun, and then those primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary ones. Where we are in the food chain, who's at the top of the pyramid, primary producers would be the fruits, vegetables, moving on to the herbivores, carnivores. Where humans lie in this entire scheme is at the trophic position of 2.2. While we might think about ourselves as a pinnacle with food as energy as a source of caloric intake, we're actually at the bottom of it. The primary producers are at the top of the energy pyramid, consuming the most amount of energy with the least amount of heat loss. As you go further up the trophic levels, you're going down in the amount of energy. So this is my favorite slide of all, that what is long life? And let's just quantify this a little bit. Is a goal to live, let's just arbitrarily say 100 years. And that would be 36525. So take any year and including your leap years, you multiply by 365 and a quarter days. And is that a realistic goal, or is that just wishful thinking? This Friday, my dad will be turning 85, so I'm really happy that that's the case. And his health is 100%. Here he is showing Callistic had to tie a surgical knot earlier this year. A photograph of him while he was a medical student, not yet an MD. And he was very clearly able to tell me, based on the coat that he was wearing, exactly where it was and what year it was. Hopefully that will be inherited through our family and in yours as well. This is something that has been popularized in culture, the blue zones, as a marker for longevity. And there's these areas in the world where populations of older men and women were observed. There were a number of things that were in common amongst octogenarians, nonagenarians, up to 100 years old plus. And what they had in common are a number of things, including avoiding smoking, eating a plant-heavy diet, that's your plant-based diets, having some moderate physical activity, having hopeful engagement, and then surprisingly, very specifically, legumes and beans. And I'll discuss what that includes. And you would think that, well, maybe it's cultural, maybe it's historical, maybe it's the place where they live. But added to the list this past summer was Singapore as the world's sixth blue zone. And the average age for men and women were 80 and 85 respectively. The factors that contributed to longevity was advanced healthcare system, public housing options. So one of the things that they do is they take care of elder family members to live close to the core family. They taxed unhealthy foods and they subsidized healthy foods. So the quality of food is actually monitored on a governmental level. It's not just the longevity that we want to consider, but also the quality of life too. From the Global Burden of Disease Health Study, despite having longevity, the last 10 plus years may be associated with some disability. So we're not only talking about the length of a life, but also the quality that you're enjoying as well. So let's just take an overview of what plant-based diets. I'm going to talk about some common myths that you might have with plant-based diets. I'll go into the why specifically as it is related to cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity. And since I'm a nephrologist, I'm going to put in the chronic kidney disease aspect of it with photos throughout. Hopefully you'll also, have an appreciation of how simple it really is to have a plant-based diet, but also to demonstrate this for your patients as well. So what is a plant-based diet? Really, essentially, it's to promote foods derived from plants. So you'll hear me say this a lot. It's your fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. If you just make your mantra, then it'll just become routine. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And it excludes or limits animal products as best as possible, meat, dairy, and eggs. And if your patient says, but I'm not a vegetarian, well, I would reply, oh, I'm not one either. There are different variations with the emphasis of consuming foods that primarily come from plants, but you don't have to be a strict vegetarian to enjoy this, nor do you have to always think of vegetarian as being the end-all be-all of what all healthy food is. And I'll demonstrate that as well. So let's just talk about some common myths. Let's go to myth number one. True or false, having a plant-based diet means going strictly vegan or vegetarian. And this is false. So you can simply just alter. And again, we want to start moving the pendulum towards something that is more whole food plant-based. Here I have dinner, yesterday's protein, and then added fruits and vegetables and herbs. And that was it. There's a lot of flexibility in that. Not only is it accessible, but also enjoyable with the thought of being more healthy. So there's a whole spectrum of plant-based diets, going from vegan all the way to just simply reducing processed foods. Vegan exclude all animal products, including meat and dairy. There's a lot of definitions within vegetarian, including lacto-vegetarians, ovo-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Again, a lot of different definitions within the spectrum of plant-based diets. There's pescatarians, which only include fish and seafood. And then there's also flexitarians or reducitarians, where they try to make a conscious effort to reduce the amount of meat and dairy. Again, I don't try to force anyone to go all or none with this, just being more mindful of what you're consuming and where your energy is coming from and where the food is being sourced. There's a myriad of healthy diets under different names because there are so many different kinds of diets. Just distill it and break it up in different categories. The first category I would say is the foods to eat. The next category, what foods to limit or avoid or restrict. And then we're talking about food quantity in terms of amounts and timings. Again, I'm putting it into these categories to make it more simple to think about, but really it all is very flexible, essentially moving more towards whole foods and plants. what foods to eat, this whole slide I can sum up with saying that it's more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. In the Mediterranean diet, they use olive oil, they have red wine, and limiting red meat and processed foods. So you have the DASH diet, which is a medical treatment to reduce high blood pressure, low-fat diets, and flexitarian diets. And here I have a picture of different types of basil with simple mozzarella and tomatoes. You've got some salt and some truffle oil. That's more about textures added to your meal. Myth number 2, eating a plant-based diet causes vitamin deficiencies and doesn't provide enough protein to build muscle. Again, people think of red meat as the only way to have good quality protein. Taking the leftovers of a steak dinner that was in a large amount of quantity, you can break that up and just add more fruits and vegetables. This is also false. So the nutritional elements that we're looking for are vitamin B12, iron, calcium, zinc. People think that vegetarians have a higher risk of iron deficiency. As you know, iron makes red blood cells. And this is sort of myth 2.5, is red meat is the best source for iron in treating anemia. Iron does come from plant-based foods. They come from greens, they come from beans. You just have to be able to source that because there's a difference between heme and non-heme iron. Animal sources of iron is packaged for you in the form of blood, whereas in leafy greens and cereals and dry fruit, these non-heme irons have different levels of iron absorption. And what you want to do is you want to combine them with vitamin C. So there's the good sources of irons, again, with legumes and soybeans, leafy greens, whole grains, to increase iron absorption. Pair that with vitamin C, typically the citrus fruits, and also to eat it on an empty stomach. So with vitamin C and iron, typically you want to do it on an empty stomach for better absorption, with calcium and vitamin D with foods. And then there's also foods that decrease iron absorption. So dairy and eggs, and also tea inhibit the absorption of non-heme irons. When it comes to plant-based diets, you want to combine these various essential amino acids together to make the complete proteins. Now, beans and rice goes together. There are plant protein sources that's already complete, but without memorizing a splattering of different foods with different colors, you essentially will get your complete plant proteins. But specifically, let's talk about legumes. There's your oilseed legumes, your fresh legumes, and then your pulses. And this is high quality, nutrient dense, low fat, high fiber, high protein. This includes your lentils, your dried peas, and your chickpeas. So don't forget to eat your peas. This is Olivia here. They're a nutrient powerhouse. They have essential minerals such as calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and these are non-heme iron, low in saturated fats, and good source of mono and polyunsaturated fats and high in fiber. So why should we eat a plant-based diet? So now I'm going to go into the studies and the research. So the role of plant-based diets in prevention and treatment of chronic medical conditions. This can all be taken in concert with metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, I'm putting in there, obesity, and then what we may not even think about with cancers. The idea of plant-based diet is really to address the development of disease in the earliest stages, to avoid the development altogether. So that's your primary prevention. Secondary prevention, now we're talking about early detection and screening. And from the kidney perspective, this is where we would be checking your UACRs and microalbuminuria before your clinical diagnosis. This is your screening. A lot of medicine right now is really addressing after diagnosis tertiary prevention, which is reducing the complications of the disease that's already been established. And if you've already been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, it's already too late. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death. There are preventive measures that one can take as related to dietary patterns, going back to a diet consisting predominantly of fruits, vegetables, whole foods, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Eating more of these foods while reducing animal protein, saturated fats, and ultra-processed foods are what a healthful dietary pattern aspire to. I'm showing this photo of animals on a spit in terms of like the original source of where the food is coming from. And while it seems fairly gruesome being grilled, the way that it's processed is the animal itself. I'm promoting the plant-based diet forms, but less processed than what ultra-processed is, where it's not even identifiable. Again, metabolic syndrome is a description of all of these things: hypertension, obesity, insulin resistance. These are risk factors for cardiovascular disease, strokes, fatty liver disease, and PCOS. And so how does plant-based diets prevent metabolic syndrome and all these cardiovascular risk equivalents? If we look at clinical trial data, including randomized controlled trials, it does establish plant-based diets as an effective lifestyle intervention, both on the macrovascular level, but also on the microvascular levels. For the macrovascular diseases, fruits and vegetables are lowering the sodium content, increases potassium, fiber, antioxidants. In diabetes, improves the insulin sensitivity and regulates blood sugar levels. It's lower in saturated fats, LDLs, and cholesterol. And with regard to obesity, it's fewer calories and saturated fats. On the microvascular level, plant fiber regulates the cholesterol levels. It stabilizes blood glucose. It supports a healthy gut microbiome, decreases inflammation, and it has more antioxidants. It's not just an observation. There's retrospective cohorts, prospective cohorts, there's randomized controlled trials, and with very robust participants, 10,000s. And as we see, health tech being introduced into our vocabulary of how we practice medicine, I think we'll see greater numbers of participants of how we utilize big data to see how this is going to be affecting behavioral changes. This is a summary slide about vegetarian diets and how it reduces cardiovascular disease through decreasing the severity of the risk factors of hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia. It's linked to less inflammation than animal based diets, reducing coronary artery disease and atherosclerosis, as well as decreasing inflammatory cytokines. And the vegan diet also promotes better bacterial flora for your microbiome. This photo is a kit that was given to patients by an insurance company. There's beans in there, legumes, mostly plant-based. This is not what I would call entirely whole foods. There's processed foods here. It doesn't look like a farm fresh or vibrant ingredient list of products. I would call them products. It's very self-labeled, but it's not what I would choose in levels of preference. So the next myth is vegan or vegetarian diets are always healthy. And that's also false. There are plenty of foods that are labeled as vegan or vegetarian healthy, but they're loaded with ingredients like sodium and sugar and saturated fats. And so what we want to do is avoid ultra-processed and processed foods as best as possible, including all the additives that makes it shelf stable. What that looks like, if we really think about what plant-based diets are, is let's talk about what the plant is the different parts of the plant, which are the stem, the roots, the fruit, flowers, leaves, and seeds. And then there's different parts of the edible part plants. You've got the leaves, the fruits, the flowers, the seeds, all, wonderfully beautiful, natural and identifiable in terms of its ingredients. And really, if you think about what leaves and seeds are, those are your herbs and spices. And this photo was taken. This is, beautiful bouquet of basil over at Randall's Island. So if you haven't seen their urban garden, I would encourage you to go visit. Just bringing it down to being culturally aware. With the anatomy of Asian flavors, what do we generally have in our pantries? Ginger, garlic, scallions, soy sauce, sesame oil, cilantro, and this is again roots, stems, leaves, and seeds. On the right side, this is butternut squash and eggplant that was given to me. It's very simple. I mean, this was grilled, and the other I added to soup and miso soup. So there's so many different combinations that one can make. Not all vegetarian vegan diets are healthy. You really want to separate that out to what is calorically dense versus what's nutrient dense. And your calorically dense foods are your snacks. They have high number of calories, they have few nutrients, they're high in saturated fats, and those are your pastries, your cakes, things that are shelf stable, highly processed meats. Your nutrient dense foods, on the other hand, has high level of nutrients. And really, if it has fewer ingredients, then that's a quick way to know that it's less processed altogether, plant-based or not. Choose the things that are nutrient dense and not just calorically dense. Really what we're talking about is the quality of the foods. Whole foods versus processed foods versus the ultra processed foods. And what the whole foods are, these are the minimally processed or unprocessed foods that is in its original state. They don't have additives and preservatives. Again, your fruits, your vegetables, your whole grains, nuts, and seeds. And they have a lot of fiber, which is good for regulating the amount of sugar in your body. This is, examples of, things that are recognizable on the top with spices, originally derived from seeds, and then this is quinoa and butter lettuce cups. Whole foods versus processed foods. So processed foods then undergo some level of processing, but it's still minimal compared to ultra-processed foods. Ingredients include canned vegetables, as we saw in the box earlier, your whole grain bread, yogurt, fruit. It would be very difficult to only eat completely original unprocessed foods, but it does, with processed foods, you still retain some amount of their original nutritional value. So again, the canned foods from tomatoes or bread from wheat. If you add any heat to any original food, that's already considered processed. The big distinction really is processed versus ultra-processed foods. The ultra-processed foods are your heavily processed foods that contain a lot of additives and preservatives, very shelf-stable. The ingredients have more chemicals than food, and I would call them products rather than food itself. They are low in nutrients, they have added sugars, fats, salt, and while this is cute for, an Instagram pic, it's not something that you want to add into your daily diet. Looking at what healthy versus unhealthy foods are is really dependent on the processed levels of food quality, and it's further distance from what the original source is. So you've got your healthy plant foods, which are your fruits, vegetables, nuts. Your unhealthy plant foods, which is derived from that, which are your fruit juices, your refined grains, and your sugar-sweetened drinks and desserts. And then you've got your animal foods too. And it's correlated to disease as well, as far as your heart disease, diabetes, cancer, strokes, chronic kidney disease, as far as what is your plant-based diets separated into healthy and unhealthy plant-based. Just to break it up, think plant food groups, animal food groups, try to go towards the plant food. And then within the plant foods, what are the healthy plant foods versus the less healthy? When you separate that out, and here's a hazard ratio, when you break down what the plant-based diets of healthy and unhealthy diets, the unhealthy diets are very similar to the animal products themselves. Looking at animal proteins and plant-based proteins, also consider the level of processing involved in the less healthy plant foods, because in some ways that is similar to, or even worse than eating our original forms of animal. And then there's also, on top of that, the ultra-processed animal foods like beef jerky and luncheon meats to try to move towards whole food plant-based diets with your plants, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, seeds, and nuts. It reduces the risk of diabetes due to having lowered glycemic index, reduced risk of obesity, reduced processed foods. You have your healthier fats, high fiber, which is important in trying to prevent rapid spikes in blood sugars. It increases your insulin secretion, and then you also have your antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, which is rich in fruits and vegetables. Obesity, again, it's not just, calories in, calories out. Even modest weight loss, 5% less body weight, it's been shown to lower the risk of chronic disease. The growing weight of US adults is related to how much processing there is in the foods that we consume. Not just quantity of the calories in and out, but also thinking about the adipose tissue itself, that this is a metabolically dynamic endocrine organ. It's not just a storage site for excess energy. There's like white fat and brown fat. White fat synthesizes a number of hormones for coagulation, for appetite regulation, immunity. It's a very rich organ itself. It's not just increase or decrease depending on the calories we consume. There's different types of fatty acids. With animal proteins, you already have the fat that's already inherent, but there's also good forms of fat. And what we want to try to move towards is those plant forms of fatty acids that are healthier for you. And how does plant-based diets help with obesity? Again, reducing the food intake, reducing the saturated fat intake, and as well as the caloric intake. It's very cultural here as well. So on the right, we have a photo. This was taken in Taiwan, where beans and legumes is a part of, or eating red beans is part of dessert. And while that itself is healthy, when you add the sugar to it, then we've made something, that was originally very healthy into something that is less. So in terms of looking at the types of good quality versus poor quality of fats, the saturated fats, animal fats is what we want to try to avoid. We want to move towards the polyunsaturated fats, and then among those, the omega-3 fish oils, walnut oils, the hemp oils, monounsaturated fats like your olive oils, almond oils, plant oils, avocado oils, that at least is preferable to the saturated fats that you find in animals. And just a quick note about obesity and how it's related to cancer. So there are modifiable risk factors, including tobacco use, obesity, poor diet, decreased physical activity. It doesn't seem like it's correlated, but 1 in 3 cancer deaths is related to excess body weight, the fat and inflammatory aspects. The main mechanisms identified, the fat cell and that metabolically dynamic organ produces estrogen, which can make the fat cells multiply. You've got the insulin growth factors, and then you've got the inflammation. So these are 3 separate ways, but it's all correlated in terms of like unopposed estrogen and other theories too, which is being studied. There is a correlation there. And so when we look at foods and cancers, obesity and alcohol increases the risk of several types of cancers worldwide. More specifically for colorectal cancer, there is an association with processed meats, and red meat is probably the highest contributor. There's also other foods like salted fish that is associated with nasopharyngeal cancers. It's not clear cut. Fruits and vegetables will decrease it, but it's related. Just moving into what I do for a living, the kidneys don't always take the top spot in talking about cardiovascular disease and cardio risk factors and diabetes and obesity. But, this is all in the same organism and working the same organs, and anything that my patient says, well, what should I eat? And like, well, anything that's good for your heart and your brain, that's good for your kidneys as well. This is chickpeas I have on the side, by the way. So eat your legumes. Chronic kidney disease affects more than 10% of the US population. Most people don't even know that they have it. It's exceedingly costly, not only just as a public health crisis, but dialysis and how it's so preventable using dietary interventions, namely diabetes and hypertension, the primary reasons of why people have CKD. What we want to try to do is reduce the risk factors that cause kidney disease, not just the progression of the disease, which is when I see them, but try to prevent, again, in the primary prevention model, hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. By the time I see them, it's CKD 3, 4, sometimes even 5. And now I'm working at trying to prevent the complications of the kidney disease and stave off dialysis as best as possible. Those complications include metabolic acidosis, hyperphosphatemia, hyperkalemia, and really deciding like when is the moment of triggering that end stage kidney replacement treatment versus trying to prevent the progression of chronic kidney disease. The standard American diet with CKD is very much associated with diabetes nephropathy, which is a huge risk factor, with animal proteins causing hyperfiltration, increased acid load. If we are able to take in more fruits and vegetables, that would increase the bicarbonate in our bodies and reduce the acidosis. Evidence shows that plant-based diets in treating diabetic nephropathy can be pursued. Myth number 5, you should avoid all forms of potassium and phosphorus in the CKD diet. Now, this is something that wasn't taught even in my fellowship. We were taught, that we should advise our patients if they do have hyperkalemia or CKD to try to avoid the tomatoes, the potatoes, the avocados, the coconut water, and bananas. And if you're going to eat the potatoes, then you take off the skin or peel it. So this was very much our renal diet. And you'll see that in the materials when you go on to many of these sites. But now suggesting that we avoid plant-based forms of nutrients is outdated. And what we are now recommending with a renal diet is that we still want to restrict the potassium, but not necessarily from fruits. The recent studies from 2022 that there isn't an increase in serum potassium with plant-based dietary potassiums. And, the reasons include that we have increased fiber, and we usually prescribe medications to try to reduce it. With increasing fiber, we lose the potassium through your bowel movements. We increase the alkalizing effects of metabolic acidosis using fruits and vegetables. We improve insulin sensitivity, and the bioavailability of both dietary potassium and phosphorus is less in the body when it's sourced from plants than just from animals. Again, this is what we used to say, don't have high potassium foods, but this is from coconuts and bananas. Actually, now we're turning around and saying not to eat an excessive amount, but we don't have to restrict it as tightly as we have before. Same thing with phosphorus. We usually prescribe medications and say decrease the amount of phosphorus in your diet, and that would, cause me some conflict because a lot of times the leafy green vegetables is where the phosphorus is found. Is it inorganic phosphorus, which is in the form of processed foods like Coca-Cola, where you have 90% bioavailability, or are they organic forms, of phosphorus? And there's a difference between plant sources and animal proteins. So from plant sources, because they have their phosphorus in the form of phytase, the plant proteins has lower GI absorption, so 10 to 30% bioavailability, whereas phosphorus from animal proteins is more readily absorbed with 40 to 60% bioavailability. Again, inorganic sources, a lot of times it's in the form of frozen foods and additives and preservatives and colas. It's 90% bioavailability. And if you just look at the far right, that's clearly being demonstrated with the amount of gastrointestinal absorption from inorganic sources, organic sources, and then amongst the proteins that are in the organic protein section, it's animal and vegetables. So with CKD, there is a higher risk for metabolic acidosis. When we compare fruits and vegetables to what we prescribe, which is bicarbonate, the change in bicarbonate is really comparable. It's not that much, but when we use fruits and vegetables instead of bicarbonate, there's other variables, including the cardiovascular disease risk indicators like blood pressure and change GFR and LDL, that is favorable when you eat fruits and vegetables as a way to decrease the amount of acid in your body compared to a medication. And so our approach to our patients is to try to use more plant-based protein diets and not be as concerned as we had, strictly limited from before. We also want a low protein diet that will slow down the uremic toxin generation, slow down CKD and cardiovascular risk. And this is just a quick graphic. The plant-dominant low-protein diet is what we're aiming for. And again, this is in addition to medications and avoiding nephrotoxins, but the idea is to reduce the sodium, to try to have more fiber in your diet. The hard endpoints is to slow down CKD and try to prevent kidney failure and dialysis and improve survival and cardiovascular health. So again, I'm not avoiding medications or the use of it, but if we can try to use natural aids, then that would be preferable. Going back to the healthy diets and bringing that back into the fore is just breaking down the quality of the energy source, what foods to eat, what foods to avoid, which are mostly your processed foods, and then the amount and the intervals by which we eat it. All the diets that I have here is in the spectrum of plant-based diets, but I'm just categorizing it so that it doesn't become confusing with all these different terms, this diet versus that diet. The essence to lead with whole foods, less processed foods. The quality of the energy that we eat, we want fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, trying to avoid as much as possible animal products. And these are just variations. The Mediterranean diet, the DASH, low fat, flexitarian, reducitarian. Think about the quality of the carbohydrates. You can have a lot of carbohydrates in the form of pasta, but that's not the healthiest way to go. It's plant-based, but it's a refined grain. The quality of your carbohydrate is related to the whole grain, which includes the bran and the germ, whereas with refined grains, the bran and the germ is removed during processing. Look for the words whole in the food label. Whole wheat, brown rice, oats, quinoa, barley. The bran, especially the outer layer, is rich in fiber, where we derive quality nutrients. With refined grains, they'll polish off all the good stuff, and then the vitamins and nutrients are added back into the product. These again are the foods not to eat. For the most part, this is all, aside from the dairy, plant-based as well. To think about the level of processing. Paleo diet, Whole30, gluten-free, these are all focusing on trying to avoid ultra-processed foods like the added sugars, focusing on whole foods. Besides what to eat, what to avoid, a lot of diets, these two particularly, Weight Watchers and intermittent fasting, is about food and timing and what we write in a prescription, quantity, how we take it, and how often, frequency and duration. What intermittent fasting is, if you're only allowed to eat a certain number of hours, it's harder to overeat because you're giving yourself that structure. And I don't want to say limitation or structure or depriving yourself. When you're sleeping, you're not eating. And if you just eat breakfast a little bit later, it's not impossible. And I think as physicians, we probably have done some form of intermittent fasting without even knowing it. And this is a table of what we would think is sushi, but actually it's not. Is plant-based diets boring? If you're worried about having the same ingredients over and over, then maybe it's time to think outside the box. This is red pepper and eggplant and tofu skin. If I didn't tell you that that's what it was, I don't think anyone would really think that it was a deprivation of fish. But now that I've said it, maybe your thinking is different. So going back into plants and how we use it and how colorful it can be versus that box of cans and processed foods, let's look at the plant again, right? So this is the primary energy produces what, when we think, well, I can't eat anything, it's just fruits and vegetables. If you think about what animals are, it's just body parts of the cow, the chicken, or the pig, right? But if you think about the biodiversity of plants that are out there, it's much more variable than animal products or foods. You've got your root vegetables, you've got your stems, you've got your leaves and your flowers, and this is all part of various parts of the plants. And we just have to think about it in a different way. And I think once we do, then you'll appreciate the color and the flavor and the textures of creating a meal. And here's more fruiting vegetables, pod vegetables that I've alluded to before with the legumes, and then the seeds, where our energy is coming from. The primary producers are where most of the energy is stored. And as we go up the food chain, we're losing heat and losing energy and the good quality of the original source to begin with. Lastly, how should we eat a plant-based diet? Throughout this entire presentation, hopefully that'll inspire you to just look at food and plants in a different way. That'll help you with talking to your patients in the clinic, really paying attention to what their needs are, what their preferences are, what their hiccups may be in terms of having some hesitation. And a new kind of prescription with a culinary prescription, think the quality of the energy source, the quantity, frequency, and duration. That's our prescription. Eat more plant-based whole foods that are nutrient dense. Again, these are your fruits, your vegetables, your whole foods, your legumes, your nuts and seeds, to try to avoid or limit your animal products, and particularly the overly processed, ultra-processed, calorie-rich foods. So it's not just avoiding animals, it's more so avoiding the chemicals in overly processed foods. If we got into the culinary aspect of what processed foods is, and how we apply heat, how we cook things, if you think about deep frying versus water boiling versus grilling versus, fermentation, these are various forms of cooking methods as well. And so that's a whole nother lecture. And then there's your frequency and duration, which are your directions, how much or amount of food at what times and for how long. And when you talk to your patient, if you say, well, become a vegetarian, no one's going to appreciate that. But if you say, oh, what's possible? Let's see what they're eating to begin with, is to know what they're eating now and also who you're eating with. Or do you eat alone? Do you eat with your family? Are you doing takeout? Are you, what is the situation? And focusing on, rather than limiting and avoiding, but what can you do to add? So I had a patient where dessert has to be part of the meal. I'm not going to convince her otherwise. But is it possible for us to add fruit to it. I'm not saying replacing it. I'm saying just add a little bit. And all of a sudden, by adding that, you're going to be decreasing the portion size. And this is done in restaurants all the time when you add a little green or herb to your dish, or you add fruit to the dessert. All of a sudden, its presentation is magnified. Talking to your patients to add more quality proteins like legumes and fungi. When it seems like an impossible task, then put it into a framework of what's possible, just like we would a prescription. Well, can we do it for a week? Let's see what it looks like in a week's time or 2 weeks. 30 days. Can we check labs in a month's time and see where you go? How do you feel? So this is basically the tenets of a culinary medicine prescription, having the conversation and then just following up. Setting a reasonable time to see if there's any results, monitoring labs, whether it be your hemoglobin A1C or cholesterol or blood pressure, and then just encouraging thinking about the food and having that pause between choosing and ingesting or consuming, because it's what you choose at the grocery store. By the time it's on, in your home or at the table, if you present pizza at the nursing station, that's what you're going to eat. However, if the only options are a tray of fruit, then that's likely what people are going to go for. And so myth number 7, true or false, eating healthy is difficult to do. And here I have Callista and Olivia. They're 100 months at this point, 8.25 years. Making sushi, we didn't have rice yet, so we're just taking a tray of vegetables and rolling it up and, having a lot of fun. But, is it difficult to do? No. It's fun to make. But what is long? What is life? I encourage you to think about what that means for you, because 100 years, if that's what you think longevity is for you, it's 36525 days. And what are you doing in those days? If you just really break that down to what are we doing today? What are we doing tomorrow? Then all of a sudden we're being much more present with how we're eating and how many days we have in our lives. And this is just a slide that Olivia was helping me with, and she enjoys putting this together. And so I think, kids are so smart these days, but candy is one of the most unhealthy foods. And, something's happening, because I know this sounds like me. Anything that grows from a ground or comes from a tree is pretty much what you want to go for. So that's your whole food. And at the end, we've got the burger, which is fairly processed. So happy Halloween. This is the kids at 9 months. And I showed this slide 4 years ago. Well, 4 years ago, it wasn't current, but this is, them being pumpkin and strawberries, promoting good foods. This is where they are now. This is a year apart, 2021, 2022. And, seeing them grow. This is, for me anyway, what life is, just these continuous moments of time and seeing them grow up. And that for me is very meaningful. Feel free to connect. This is my YouTube QR, and there's general sources as well. And I thank you for your attention. Fruits from Jamaica, and this is pumpkins listening to each other's soulful hearts.
That was an amazing lecture. I want to thank you, and I can't help myself. I learned so much. There's a lot of talk about, like, as Asians, I eat a lot of tofu. I love tofu. I love edamame. And I guess my question is, a lot of times I have patients that have breast cancer, and they talk about how soy products is like a phytoestrogen. And what do you think about soy and people have breast cancer? You think that might increase recurrence of cancer, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It hasn't really been panned out. Soy and its risk association with the amount of estrogen has not really been very clearly delineated with the amount of soy products. There are different levels also of soy processing, from the fermented dark soy sauce versus the edamame, like the green bean. And so I don't think that has ever even been looked at as far as like how far like soy and those associations with cancer risk factors. So do you have the young green edamame, and then as it dries up becomes like the white beans that you see soy milk is derived from, and then soy sauce and tofu and koji and miso is then another level of processing, and that has been shown to be very helpful. So, and I would say the edamame that you're eating, if it's the green soybeans, is favorable to eat. So there's a question about natto, Japanese fermented beans. So it's derived from soybeans, from the edamame, which is green, and then it gets dried, which is white. But when you ferment them and then you add the salt and you add the cultures to it, it becomes fermented. And fermented foods are typically seen as good, adding flavor to your foods and without adding all the salt, the idea of it being processed with time. If you think about yogurts, if we think about yeast, we think about the probiotics and prebiotics that we eat that's good for the gut biome. These are healthy bacteria and we live off of them. The other thing that I didn't talk about were decomposers, the fungi in the entire energy pyramid is that at every step, those are the decomposers that are breaking things down, where antibiotics are coming from and how things are decomposed. That's also another source of very rich nutrients and proteins.
What do you think about MSG? Because I don't know why they call it Chinese restaurant syndrome, but
Oh, that's
the
just
name.
racism.
I totally agree. But the question was about Chinese restaurant syndrome. It was like, what do you think about MSG? Because when you
Mhm.
eat out, there's a lot of MSG. And what do you think about preserved foods? Because, culturally, they have, what is it, salted fish and, lapcharon with that Chinese sausage and lap
Mhm.
lap, which is that preserved duck. So this person has a
Yeah.
lot of questions. So could you answer that
Okay.
as well? Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah, so when you preserve things, then you're adding more salt to the products itself. It's very good as a desiccant because the idea of preserving foods is to protect it from decomposing when we didn't have refrigeration. You're basically drawing out the water with salt so that bad bacteria doesn't live there. So processed foods like sausages with deli meats, these are items that would be unhealthy. That's different from fermentation. Fermentation is natural, like yeast or bacteria, to create a more healthy gut than something that is just added saturated fats, sugars, salt. It's a different level of processing. They're both considered processing, but one is a natural process and the other is artificial with different purposes.
Do you mean like yogurt or yeast? But if you have it like with salt, like salted fish, there's no that I mean that's just salting or
So
salted
it's
egg.
salted
Is
fish.
that
Well,
okay?
yeah, be mindful of the condition. Are you hypertensive? Are you eating the entire amount every
Oh
single
no,
day?
like
Because
they
then
use it with a little bit of kanji, and with
right. So again, if we're talking about like that as a salt substitute, we do need salt. I mean, we're salty beings, so we do need salt. We're just talking about excessive every day, like having sausage every day versus as a flavoring. Again, I mean, I'm not a vegetarian, vegan, strictly non-meat eater myself, but if I were to use meat, then I use it more as a flavor than I do as the main meal.
so you're
And
saying
and I
basically
think
salted food is better than let's say corned beef or hot dogs where there's actually
right,
nitrates.
because there's nitrates in it, there's other added preservatives in those foods. And then the other question about MSG. So again, glutamate is the breakdown of umami. That's what glutamate is. So it hasn't been shown to be dangerous for you in the natural forms. We find that in Parmesan cheeses. We find that in seaweed and nori. I mean, that's the central structure of what umami savoriness is. When you add the sodium part to glutamate, that's the part that causes high blood pressure and for you to feel like you have a dry mouth because now it's salt plus glutamate. So again, salt is another taste flavor profile that we have on our tongues. Sweet, salty, savory, which is glutamates, bitter. If you think about, as physicians, if you really want to think about, how we write out our labs with sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, BON, creatinine, glucose, and then you've got your, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. If you think about that as far as food goes, salt is your sodium volume. You've got your glutamate, which is like a function of nitrogenous bases. You've got your bicarbonate, which is acid base. Acid base is like bitterness, flavor, and pungency. I mean, so these are, if you think about what taste is, it's also what we are as well.
I think we'll have to have you come back because this was really good. And there've been comments about how good your slides are. People are saying they would love to just review it. I think they just want to eat healthy. So if you could forward the slides. Oh, one last question. They say now that there's so much preservative in foods today that we eat. If you're buried and they exhume you, you're kind of like a little bit embalmed. Have you heard about this?
I mean, I think that would probably be very extreme, but I also think about it when I talk to my patients is just making it make sense. Like just sometimes we just look at things and we're not putting two and two together. When you go to a grocery store in the grocery layout, it's the things that are refrigerated are your fruits and vegetables on the perimeter because that's where the power outlets are. Within the aisles are generally shelf stable and more processed. Think about what we're consuming, what are, just having that, just like that next thought and meditating that a little bit further about what we're putting into our bodies. The whole idea, and seems so simple, like you are what you eat. It really is true because if I'm eating, say, a cracker, then that cracker is going to be broken down into what my body uses as energy and its cell functions. So it's not just thinking about it as like, oh, getting good energy. I mean, thinking about these are going to be broken down to the amino acids, the building blocks to our life functions and processes. And, do I want to go through all those middlemen and all the intervening parties to get to the direct source, or do I want to just go to the direct source? Because these are the building blocks. There's so much food around that having a collection is already going to make your complete protein.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I mean, this has been such a good program, and I really appreciate you doing this for us, Dr. Huang. And again,
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
we really have to have you come back next year
Right.
again because this was great. Thank you
Can I
so,
just give the
so
same
much.
lecture? And I had forgotten because I went straight to the slides to encourage people to like have a glass of wine. I was going to drink it before, but actually it's beet ginger turmeric. So see, there's no
Oh,
legs on it. But and if
well,
you have, the kids who are going out as devils, then once you drink it, you're gonna have red teeth. So that's kind of spooky.
well, it's not the slides, it's the presentation from the honored speaker, you. So thank
Oh,
you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mary.
And I want to thank you everyone for joining us tonight and have a very good evening, everyone.
All right. Good evening. Thank you for your time. Enjoy and eat
Thank
well.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.